Give it just another minute for people to join. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. My name is Siegel. I am well, first of all, let me say thank you all for joining us today for this panel on seeking a public sector career in a recession. For those of us who are a little bit removed from law school, but not too far removed, we had an experience similar to ones facing people who are just entering or just about to graduate from law school, which is trying to seek a job in the middle of a recession. And so we thought we could share some of our experiences from that time with those who are in that process right now. A couple of process things first. I think the chat disabled the chat function is disabled. However, if you have questions, and there'll be time for questions at the end, there's a Q&A box that you can type your questions into, and hopefully we'll have a few at the end. The second is, for those who are interested, there's CLE credit available, and I'll repeat this at the end, but to get CLE credit, just email lcemails at acslaw.org at the end. And finally, I'd like to thank our co-hosts, the Austin Lawyer Chapter, the Columbus Lawyer Chapter, the LA Lawyer Chapter, the Puget Sound Lawyer Chapter, and the Bay Area Lawyer Chapter as well. So with that, I'll briefly introduce our panelists, and then we have a series of questions that I'm going to ask them to answer based on their experiences the last time around. And then at the end, I'm hoping that we'll have 10 or 15 minutes from the audience for you all to ask your questions as well. So briefly, and all of these very distinguished panelists have resumes already that are too long for me to go through in detail. Sill Habig graduated from Yale Law in 2009. She worked as an affirmative litigation fellow, a partnership between the San Francisco City Attorney's Office and Yale Law School right after law school before clerking on the Ninth Circuit in the Northern District of California before joining then Attorney General Kamala Harris's team and working as part of her senior staff. After working for Attorney General Harris, she went on to found the Public Rights Project, which is a nonprofit that was formed to train attorneys in partnership with progressive state and local governments. Next, we have Adelina Acuña, who graduated from Stanford in 2012 and was part of the inaugural class of the honors program in the California Department of Justice that Jill either founded or was instrumental in founding. And Adelina and Jill are also both members members emeritus of the ACS Bay Area chapter. Next, we have Jerome Price, who graduated from Berkeley in 2011 and clerked for Judge Damon Keith on the Sixth Circuit, and then became an assistant federal public defender in the Eastern District of California, where he remains working today. And finally, we have Gabriel Ravel, who graduated from Harvard in 2009, clerked for a year in the Eastern District of Washington before working at a nonprofit for a year, and then became the assistant general counsel at the California Health Benefit Exchange, was the general counsel for the California Department of Managed Healthcare, and then the general counsel for the California Health and Human Services Agency, and just started a new job as Deputy Secretary and General Counsel as the California Government Operations, at the California Government Operations Agency. So thanks again, all of you, for joining, and I'm sure that people will be very interested to hear your experiences. So I think we'll start with a question, and maybe Jill, you could go first with this. The first question is, what led you in law school or before to seek a public sector career straight out of law school? And sorry, just to be clear, I think we'll go around to each of the panelists to allow each one of you to answer the questions, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Thanks everyone for joining. This happens to be my favorite topic to talk about, getting a job in the public sector. So I'm really excited to talk to everybody today. What motivated me to look for a public sector job right out of law school were a couple things. In many ways, I feel like working in government is kind of the Goldilocks option for a legal career in so many ways. You get a lot of great early experience as an attorney. Government has to leanly staff cases. So unlike if you go to a big law firm or even sometimes a really big nonprofit where they have a lot of attorneys staffed on, large cases, you can get a docket of cases right away. You can sort of sink your teeth directly in issues and get experience relatively quickly. But you're also not, you're coming into an infrastructure. So you're, not out on your own. You have supervision and mentorship and things like that from the office. I also really appreciated the opportunity in government to really be able to have a seat at the decision-making table and to think about how to use government power and authority both effectively and in a way that promotes equity and justice for the residents that the government is serving. And so that opportunity as a young lawyer to be able to think about how can government better serve its people? How can government lawyers use the legal authority that is sort of bestowed on us by the people in responsible, equitable ways? That was really attractive to me early in my career. And I was able to get some exposure in law school to impact litigation through government that just got me really interested in thinking through those challenges of how you, as a government lawyer, make government work better for people.
Great. Adelina, how about you?
Second everything Jill said. For me in particular, my only work experience before law school was 3 years in a plaintiff's class action firm. And I had sought that out when I was graduating college because I had apprenticed in some kind of socialist law offices. I was really motivated by the idea of law for good, of litigation for good, of affirmative law. And the experience of working in the private class action sector made me realize that I really respected the mechanism, the idea of law as a mechanism for change, but I didn't like the idea of playing for one team all the time, because there were times when I felt like it was moving the ball forward on something I cared about, and times when I felt like it was headed in the wrong direction, or at least forcing compromises that were not as principled or as ideologically consistent as I wanted my career to be, as I wanted, my work to do. And the public sector, when I finally in law school had experience apprenticing in the public sector, I felt like I had found that. I finally found in a practice where you represent the people, that was a space where you can say, what does good look like here? What is the public good here? Where should I push the levers? What is the right outcome that truly benefits the principles I care about, the justice ideals I care about? There's obviously a huge variety of types of government practice. When I say that, I'm speaking about particularly affirmative litigation. That's the area I work in, that's the area I know best. But for me, the reason I love it is that I have the flexibility and the authority and frankly the moral responsibility in everything I do to see the bigger picture and work for the optimal outcome from just a public good perspective, as opposed to a particular client's perspective, or as opposed to frankly kind of one ideological camp. So and frankly, I come from a family of public servants. Everyone in my family is a public school teacher. So also I was surprised and happy to find when I did enter the government space that it felt like coming home. It fit my model of what grownups do and what a job is and what one should do with their life. So I love being a public servant just as a way to position myself in the world.
Yeah, amen to that. My parents were also teachers, so it does feel like coming home. Jerome, how about you? What led you to leave the to a job with the IPD round of law?
First of all, good morning and or afternoon now. Thanks for having me. So I was actually a public school teacher before I went to law school. And so public service was kind of like in my DNA and one of the main motivators for me to go to law school. So I think I definitely agree with that sense of homecoming once back in public service after law school. As you mentioned, Sam, after law school, directly after law school, I clerked on this with the Sixth Circuit. And that sort of opened my eyes to the criminal practice. And the difference for me is, we represent people, indigent people who are charged with federal offenses. And so my client, I represent individual clients, and those, their interests may vary case to case. And I like that sort of variety of dealing with, maybe wire fraud and one moment and something completely different with another case. I like the idea of being able to work in the district court and also work in the Court of Appeals if any of my cases were appealed. So also I would second the notion that I like as a young attorney, government work, work in the public sector does tend to give you more exposure early on. One of my first cases was a felony bank robbery where I was assigned as second chair, and the first chair and I worked really closely in resolving that case. And so, yeah, a lot of flexibility, sense of purpose, and also what hasn't been mentioned so far is I think it does provide a very healthy work-life balance, especially with, I'll say this, so the federal courts are pretty much closed. There are no in-person hearings right now. And so it does allow us to really not feel as under the gun when dealing with our cases. And so I do appreciate that as well.
And Gabriel, how about you? What led you to lead a public sector career soon after leaving law school?
Well, thank you, Sam, for having me and for the questions. And I really appreciate having students who are interested in public service. One of my favorite things to do is encourage students to join a life in government service in particular. I found it to be an incredibly rewarding career. So I too come from a family of public servants. My mother in particular was a longtime government attorney and still has spent her entire career in government. The year before I went to law school, I volunteered at a clinic in a rural part of Washington State where the majority of the patients were farm workers, most of whom were either uninsured or seriously underinsured. And so I saw the consequences of that for them. Not having access to good care, people would get extremely sick or sometimes even die needlessly from treatable illnesses. And so having had the opportunity now to work in expanding access to coverage and making sure that people's coverage works the way it's supposed to has been just an incredible honor. I genuinely believe in the ability and the responsibility of government to improve the lives of, in particular, the less fortunate members of our community. I think in government you get an incredible variety of experience, and as many have said already, you get exposed early on to some more complicated things if you demonstrated the aptitude for it. There's a lot more types of issues that you can see from various statutory and constitutional issues, not just limited to whatever your field might be, that you might not have the same exposure to in a private sector context.
I keep forgetting that I'm muting myself, so I end up speaking. For the next question, we'll start with Adelina, and maybe I'll put two together. When did you start thinking about pursuing a career in the public sector in terms of taking concrete steps, not the sort of broader thought about going there? And then when you were starting that process or throughout that process, what strategies and resources did you use or rely on as you were going through that process?
I did. I am not a role model in this regard, so I'm going to keep it very brief. I was not good at using my law school's resources. I was not good at asking for help. I'm still not, but I've at least conscious of it and tried to do better. So I relied more on Google than on just walking into a career advisor's office and getting more concrete help and, you know, lists of people to talk to. Do that. I frankly just had a lot of twists of luck that made that strategy work for me. That said, you know, if you know, the nice thing about government is it's pretty clear what the government is and where to find it. So, you know, you just start mining the websites for government bodies that interest you. But that said, there's probably a lot of government you don't know about. There certainly were opportunities I probably missed by trying to do it the hard way and rather than leveraging the resources that any student has. So yeah, nothing great or systemic. And I was probably always 2 weeks behind my classmates in the timing and sending stuff out, but there you go, it worked.
Jerome, how about you?
Well, it was pretty easy for me because I kind of knew that I wanted to work at the Federal Defender's Office. And for anybody out there who's interested in doing work as a federal public defender, most of the jobs are listed on fd.org. So it was just a matter of, you know, mining the websites, as Adelina was just mentioning, and applying that way.
Gabriel, how about you?
So I did use some of my school's career services to some extent after I graduated during my clerkship. What ultimately ended up getting my first state job for me was a contact, a fellow who was my predecessor in Health and Human Services a little over a decade ago, who I'd met at Gray Davis's ill-fated second inaugural and just kept in touch with over the years. And at the time, the Affordable Care Act had just been passed, and they were creating what ultimately became Covered California, the state's health exchange. And he needed some help. He was semi-retired. It was a very tough time for hiring in the state. There was a hiring freeze in place. And so he had to get an exception to that in order to bring me on. But it was what ultimately worked was just a lucky break, I guess. But a good lesson, I think, to leverage contacts that you may have made and any network that you may have developed in addition to the school's resources, and to aggressively create those networks wherever you can.
Jill, how about you?
Yeah, so I have a few different things and then a couple things that have changed since when I was searching. So I had an interesting experience of during law school, I had an opportunity to help create what is now a clinic at Yale called the San Francisco Affirmative Litigation Project, which was basically it was a clinic that paired students with deputy city attorneys in San Francisco. And so that kind of opened my eyes to working in government in the first place. And I got my first job through that program. This is a little bit of a difficult path to replicate, which is part of actually why I created Public Rights Project later. So when I was still in law school, we actually pitched our dean to fund a full-time fellowship to run that clinic. And once the dean approved it, I applied for the fellowship. So I would second what some others have said about creating your own path and trying to advocate for yourself. That said, I found it frustrating as a law student looking for public service jobs straight out of law school. You know, there was the federal U.S. Department of Justice Honors Program. There were some federal public service fellowships available. I think the Heyman Fellowship at that time. And then there were some individual offices that had honors programs. The California AG's office honors program didn't exist at that time. And so I felt like I was kind of trying to make up a path. Now there are actually a lot more state AG honors programs. There's a Santa Clara Social Justice Impact Fellowship. And you know, part of the reason why I created Public Rights Project was to actually help provide a pathway into public service for attorneys earlier in their career. So we actually have a few fellowship programs available for folks who are just coming out of law school or folks who are a few years out. So I'm happy to talk more about that later, but that was my path, was just sort of scouring the internet and finding whether there were different scholarship or fellowship programs available, because most of the job openings at that time were not available to like entry level, straight out of law school postgrads.
I think those experiences also underscore exactly what Jill was just saying, that sometimes you need to make your own path. And especially if you're still in law school and your law school doesn't have things like the clinic that Jill set up. I mean, I have seen examples of that where someone will say, I want to create this new position or I want to create this new program. And then suddenly they're the person that's in charge of it. Shocking that that would happen given that you were the one that has designed this thing. But it can inure to your benefit to be creative and entrepreneurial in that way in law school. So on this topic, and maybe we'll start this time with Jerome, and maybe we can talk about this at a little bit of a more granular level. Are there things that you can recommend to people who have not yet started law school? We've touched a little bit on this, not yet started law school, maybe are in their first or second year, and then maybe are about to start their third year of law school, about what they should be thinking about, what they can be doing to maximize their chances of getting public sector employment upon graduation?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's something I reflect on a lot, thinking about my own law school experience. It's kind of was happenstance how I ended up where I ended up, and it goes back to leveraging the resources at your law school to your advantage and doing that early on. I talked a bit about clerking for a federal judge out of law school. It wasn't something that I went into law school thinking I would do, or even I pretty much had to talk to a colleague of mine who said, hey, you should really think about this. And it was kind of like as applications were due. So it's almost as last minute as you can imagine. So I would, exposing yourself to a lot of the different areas of the law. And I would also advocate for thinking about clerkships. The opportunity to work for a judge is invaluable. And to have that perspective and to sort of just get immersed in the legal research and seeing how these issues that we're all interested in play out in courts in real time is something that's invaluable. I wasn't exposed to that early on in law school. And so I would, to the extent that you have those opportunities available to you, I would certainly seek those out. In terms of, and that also, I think it also gives you some leverage, especially when you're a young lawyer, because at least in the federal defender's office, the way it had been when I applied in 2012 is that they had never hired an attorney. They'd never hired an attorney as young as I was, with 1 year of experience. And sort of the tradition was you had to be a public defender for a number of years before you could even consider being hired as a federal defender, because the notion was these cases were more serious, and you needed to be a tried and true trial attorney before you became a federal defender. There's a trend now, I think, nationwide where a lot of offices are hiring people closer, not fresh out necessarily, but younger attorneys. And so I would take advantage of that. And one thing that sort of can set you apart is not just a federal clerkship, but sort of experiences that you have in public service just before going to an office like ours.
Gabriel, how about you? You've talked a little bit about some of your experiences both before law school and during law school, but what are the sort of granular things that you can think about at each stages of your sort of early legal career and things that people should be thinking about in that time frame?
Sure. So when we're hiring, or at least when I'm hiring, I'm always looking for, in a new attorney, a genuine and demonstrated commitment to public service. And so if you're still in school or you're just starting out, then it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same field of the office that we're hiring in. But if you can show that you're really committed to the work and to serving the people, that's always really helpful. If you're in your third year and you're starting to look for jobs and it's tougher to find public sector jobs, I would, if it's not possible to get one right away, then just getting the right skills and experiences is always really helpful for somebody who's a year or two out. It's oftentimes harder in the state without an honors program to hire people straight out of school. At my former department, I started an honors program where we would hire a graduate legal assistant. Basically, it's a position that allows somebody who's graduated law school but hasn't yet passed the bar to start working with us. And then ideally, once they passed the bar, because there were attorney positions in the department, they could be hired on full-time after that. And so in that position, when we were hiring someone straight out, we really wanted to see a demonstrated interest in public service, ideally in health law, but not necessarily. But for people who are farther on into their careers, again, great to have relevant experience in the field, but just the relevant research, writing, and as applicable litigation experience is really helpful. So if you can't find a public sector job right away as a 3L, don't fret. Getting good experience either through clerkships, as Jerome was saying, or through a different kind of a job is a good foot in the door, particularly when things start to improve in terms of the job market.
Jill, how about you?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of different ways to position yourself. For folks who aren't yet in law school, think about working in the public sector before law school. That can take a variety of different forms. You could work on, I found campaign experience can often be helpful for going into the public sector because you're used to sort of a fast-paced environment and used to dealing with constituents in different contexts and things like that. And so I think that can be valuable experience. Working in any public agency at the local, state, or federal level can certainly be helpful. And just a demonstrated interest and passion for public interest and public service work. So that doesn't necessarily have to come directly from government specifically, but do you volunteer? Are you have you worked for a nonprofit? Have you interned for a nonprofit previously? Those kinds of things can be really helpful. In law school, I think externships during the semester and certainly over the summer can be really useful. Even if it's not for the exact office you might want to work for later, just having some of that government experience and can be really attractive. It's something that I often look for because it shows me that somebody has had experience having to kind of balance competing interests and operate with a government perspective. And so I think that can be really useful. In law school, clinical experience, I think, is also really useful. Like I said, sometimes you hit the ground running faster in a government law job. And so having some experience working with clients, working on active litigation while in law school can help you sort of cut ahead and maybe get a job earlier than you would otherwise because you have some of that experience during law school. And then clerkships are certainly useful too, although I don't think they're required by any stretch, but they can be useful either as a transition from private practice or as a first job out of law school. The only other thing I would add is to look for fellowship opportunities either from your law school directly, push your law school on whether they're public interest fellowships, for example, if they have for postgraduates, if they will allow government placements with that funding. That can be a great way to get a foot in the door with an office, even if they're not hiring for permanent staff right now. And then look for other external fellowships like the Justice Catalyst Fellowship, which I can talk more about later, and the Public Rights Project Fellowship as well.
And Adelina?
Yeah, I think what I want to say, I think synthesizes what Jill and Jerome and Gabriel said, but I'm going to label it differently to kind of emphasize two separate concepts. Anyone at any stage of this process or any stage of their career can pivot to the public sector. And what is critical is both that you become competent and then that you be competent in front of other people. And that looks different at different phases, depending whether you're a 1L or whether you're 2 years out of law school. Gabe talked about cultivating the right skills and experience. I think what it comes down to is cultivate confidence in yourself. So that means get practical skills. If you are a 3L and you want to switch gears into the public sector, it's probably going to be really hard to find an entry-level job without, a demonstrated experience or exposure to public service. But what you can do is if you're entering the private sector, no matter what job you're doing next, whether you're at a tiny boutique firm, whether you're at a big law firm, whether you are, setting up your own shop, whether you can do it in such a way that where you maximize your learning, where you get exposed to as many different lawyering skills in that field as you can, so that you can show somebody, you know, I learned, this is my learning curve, here's what I come out with, here are the skills I come out with, in whatever you choose to do. Just milk whatever you can out of it to show that you are competent. There's a difference between an entry-level lawyer and a third-year lawyer, no matter what, because this profession is an apprentice-based profession. But 3 years of learning how to do your own filings is very different than 3 years where a secretary did it all for you, for just as an illustration. So cultivate competence where you can, because that's always going to matter to a government employer. And cultivate, and when I say be competent in front of other people, networking matters everywhere, and it has a very particular flavor in government. Government attorneys compared to private sector attorneys do not spend a lot of time at mixers. We certainly can be involved in bar associations, we can go to things, but it's not the same. It's a different world. We're not building books of business. We're not, you know, as a professional matter on the happy hour circuit in the same way, because it is not part of our job. And that means that relationships really do matter in government. Knowing someone, finding out about opportunities matters, but it's been my experience that those need to be deep relationships and real relationships. It's not about, oh, I recognize that person from X. It's that person was an extern in my office and was incredible, and they did this fine work, or I've heard about them from, you know, the federal office across the street, or I met them through their clinical director, and that, you know, there's some substance to the relationship. And you can do that so many ways. I know that, you know, the honors program didn't exist when I was in law school. It came into existence in my 3L year. And I wanted that. I mean, I had left my 1L internship experience at the Attorney General's office saying, that's my dream job. That's what I want to do. I want to work in the consumer protection section there. And they said, you were awesome. Come back in 10 years and we'll hire you. And then this honors program materialized. And I thankfully had, over the time since my internship had ended, I had sustained the relationships with the lawyers I worked with there. And it was genuine. I liked them. I wanted to be their coworkers. I wanted to be their friends. So I would meet for coffee with them, you know, a couple times a year, just to maintain that familiarity, because I really liked them as people. And they were able to put in glowing recommendations for me to make the calls and send the emails internally. And I really do think that's the only, you know, I'm a good student and I have a good resume, but I was not the superlative standout student of my graduating class, but my whole self was oriented towards that position and that job because it's what I had wanted, and I had sustained a connection and a relationship to that future promise. That's you know, my one unique path, but I think that model for just know people, work for people, make them remember who you are. You can do that at any point in your career. Internships are valuable, externships are valuable, clinics are critically valuable. And I think the note to add to that is look for clinics that put you in contact with government and expose you to other government bodies and public sector bodies. The best example I can give you is a shout out to Ted Merman and his consumer clinic at Berkeley, not just for the quality of the work and the quality of Ted's work as an activist in the consumer space, but because once you're in that network, you become connected to the entire consumer protection universe of the Bay Area. You will, there are regular meetings between the Attorney General, the city attorney, the Federal Trade Commission's regional office, all the Bay Area legal aid shops. They meet regularly, they stay in touch, they work together. And what that means is, I know my office, many of us know who the graduating Berkeley students interested in consumer are every year. We know them, we know their work, we've seen them. That is incredible. And that model or versions or flavors of that exist in a lot of other spaces. So find not only opportunities that let you pursue the substance you want, but also that get you in front of the people you want to become in a real and meaningful and lasting way.
Thank you all. Those were great points and everything that I would have said as well. Really having the experience and being able to show that you had this experience. A lot of times there were people who come in with very fancy resumes, but if you don't know that they can do the work of a lawyer, which I think is very different than being even a great law student, you're a little bit hesitant about hiring them, and knowing that you have the clinic experience that Adelina and others were talking about, and be able to talk to that person come and said, yeah, man, they really know how to write a brief, they really know how to take a deposition or whatever it can be, is really important. The one other small thing that I'll add here, I think this is on a very minor level, but I think having a demonstrated commitment to a particular geographic area can matter. You know, many of us, we're all based in California. Many of us work for the California or have worked for the California Department of Justice, and people are very proud of that department and California and the work that it has done for the people. And again, that doesn't mean that if you're coming from some other place and want to move to California because you think the weather's great and all of the other wonderful things we do, that'll be a knock against you. But I think having that commitment, whether you're in California or Columbus or Minnesota or wherever it may be, that can be another thing that can help. Turning, and maybe Gabriel, we'll start with you, turning to part of the prompt of this panel. You all either graduated law school right as the last recession was beginning, or entered law school around that time and graduated over the course of the next few years. So can you maybe speak to what some of the unique challenges were that you faced seeking a career in the public sector, and how you overcame them or how you navigated them? Again, maybe we'll start with Gabriel this time.
So it was a dark time. I graduated in 2009. I was looking for my first public sector job after my clerkship ended in 2010. And that was kind of the depths of the last recession. At the time, the furloughs in state government were 3 days a month for attorneys. So there was a 15% salary reduction. It's always a bit of a sacrifice financially to come and work for the public sector, but even at that point, it was even more of one. And we've just had the furloughs return for us now. And the bigger issue was just that the market was really tight. A lot of people had lost their jobs in the private sector, and they were coming to look for government work, or they were afraid that they were going to, so they were trying to come in and work for government. For a time after during the recession, we'd see resumes of types of attorneys who you wouldn't ordinarily see applying for even lower level state attorney jobs. In my case, I just got phenomenally lucky, really. I mean, as I mentioned, there was a hiring freeze in place at the time, and so they really needed an exceptional justification to hire new staff. Fortunately, right now we do not have a hiring freeze in the state, but at the time that was the case. And really, I got there just by leveraging the network that I had. And, you know, eventually everything cleared out, the furloughs ended, and they'll end again now. But it was really tough at the time. Additionally, at the time, there was I can't remember what it stands for, but the SROA list. Essentially, because a lot of the attorneys were being laid off in other departments, those attorneys got priority for any new position, and it was really hard to hire over them. And so that was an additional challenge at the time for somebody just coming into state service. We're not at that point with the state right now, but without a personal connection to the people who are hiring you, it would not have been possible for me to join state service at that time.
Oh, Sam,
And I muted myself again. Jill.
That's okay. Just double checking. So Gabriel, you really brought back memories with the SROA list. I had forgotten all about that from my time in the AG's office. So I think, you know, like I said, I was lucky enough to have found fellowship funding to get my foot in the door in government. And so, you know, I think that is definitely one path. But I think the biggest advice I would have for this time is to not take no as an immediate and long-lasting answer on a lot of these things. And not treat the recession as a monolith that affects every government agency equally. So to give a couple examples, a hiring freeze doesn't always mean a hiring freeze, as Gabriel mentioned. You know, there are sometimes a hiring freeze means literally no discretionary budget, no filling positions. Sometimes it means you need a special reason for, you know, hiring during a freeze. And that special reason could include like you know, oh, there's a huge case that a particular section in the office is about to go to trial on, and so they could get approval for hiring a new attorney, or there's some other, you know, some new bill that was passed or something like that. So I would refresh your search on a regular basis, and look at office specific data, don't treat it as sort of government wide or government in general. A couple of other reasons, sometimes different, even different sections within the same office, and certainly different agencies, will be in different positions to be able to hire depending on their funding pipelines. So, you know, some agencies are funded through like the general fund of the city or the state, which could make them especially vulnerable during a recession, because if there are, you know, citywide or statewide budget cuts, they come out of the general fund. There are other agencies and even sections within some offices, like in the AG's office, that are special funded through certain earmarked funds. They might come through some kind of fine or fee that the state imposes, or a licensing fee. They might come from litigation settlements or something like that. And so sometimes the funding for a particular office and particular hiring might not be touched by a recession, whereas it might affect other offices. So all that is to say, like, specialize your search, and look at each section, each office individually, and then refresh it regularly. Government jobs are often posted only for, you know, 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a time. And so, you know, setting your kind of weekly list to, you know, to a weekly refresh, not a monthly refresh, would be really useful. And then if you're not seeing anything in an office that you're really interested in, don't be shy about just reaching out. It's particularly helpful if you have, you know, direct relationships there. But even a cold email, you know, if you find the right person, can sometimes at least get you an informational interview where you might be able to find out more about when they might start hiring again, or those sorts of things. So all that is to say, like, my main message is don't treat it as a monolith, and keep updating your search, because things can change quickly.
I don't know how sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just actually, one of the notes of good news about state hiring, which is all I'm qualified to speak to, a lot of work has gone in at the state level over the last couple of years at making state hiring less opaque and more user-friendly. It had a lot of improvements in that area that needed to happen, and some major improvements have been made. Particularly now, the Department of Justice has a much more robust recruiting office than we've ever had. And they actually are available before people even apply to be on the eligibility list, before people even start the job search. They actually want very badly for people who are even wondering about a state career to reach out to them. They will actually kind of hold your hand and walk you through the eligibility examination process, which is a critically important first step in seeking state employment. They'll make sure you get on that you meet certain deadlines to get on those lists. They can actually get you hooked up with subscriptions to job opportunity bulletins, so you can get affirmatively pinged when state job opportunities present themselves. And we thankfully have no hiring freeze in place at present. There are unfortunately some furloughs in place, but I don't know how else to put it. It's kind of a blessing that the last recession was still a pretty fresh memory, in that the state was much more ready for this one. The last one hit like a wave of back foot crises responses, one after the other. And this is kind of this is going better. The cuts are, the belts are tightening, but it's not been painful, and there are still jobs, there's still vacancies being filled. And importantly, there are still jobs that are open to relatively entry-level and young attorneys. And that's a completely different universe than it was in 2009, 10, 11, 12, when we all entered the force. So it's not a bleak picture, and there are resources now that there weren't. Use them and be flexible and a little more open-minded about the kinds of jobs, the subject area. And I think those opportunities may still be there with some flexibility. The one other thing that I think is really challenging, and that as a moral matter, I think it's important to be very candid about, is that depending on which part of the government you start out in, it can be incredibly difficult and require a lot of sacrifice to start start your career at a relatively low paying job in the public sector. It comes with security. It comes with a pretty predictable, safe road ahead of you, but you sacrifice a lot when you have student loans, when you are in your late 20s or early 30s and you hope to start a family and get a house someday. Those things may have to come later. That's a reality even in a good day in the government. And it's especially the reality during a recession. And it's important to be honest about that because that's just a fact of a public sector career. And I think the current circumstances can make that a little scarier for people than it used to be. The good news is so far no pay cuts, but raises may be frozen. And it's really important if you start the search to really ask those hard questions. There's no government attorney in the world who's going to hide that ball from you or who won't answer them very honestly, because we think about it all the time. And most of our salary info is public anyway, so it's not very sensitive. But it can make your life planning, I think, just a little more touchy, and it makes people a lot more risk averse. And be honest about that, be candid about that with yourself, and just go in with eyes open and thinking on a 5-year plan.
Jerome, anything to add?
No, I don't think I have much else to add to what's been said already. I think that was, I agree with everything that's been said.
Thanks. I also, on Jill's point about it not being a monolith, it's both not a monolith at this moment in time within government, but also over time. So I graduated in 2012 and I clerked twice and I worked for a private firm for about 10 months in between. And by that time, things had gotten better. And so there were more positions available. So just, it's something where you can sequence things. And even if things aren't available right now, a year from now, 2 years from now, things could pick up again. And it could be a hiring binge again, like we had in the last few years. We've gotten several questions, although I know at a couple of points, Jill, you've mentioned wanting to come back to a couple of topics. So I thought maybe if you want to talk a little bit about the Public Rights Fellowship, and I think you said the Catalyst Fellowship, and there may have been one other topic. Maybe I'll turn the floor over to you before we go to some of the audience questions.
Sure. So I just wanted to lay out a couple of resources that are available to folks, and I'm happy, you can email me at jill@publicrightsproject.org if you want more details on any of these. So if you are graduating soon, if you're coming directly out of law school, I would encourage you to look at the Justice Catalyst Fellowship. We actually partner with Justice Catalyst on fellowship projects that are placed in government offices. This is a project-based fellowship, kind of similar to like a SCAD-in, but for government. So you work with a government office and you pitch a project for a year or 2 years. They can be renewed. And so you would work with, if you wanted to go work in Adelina's section, for example, you would pitch some kind of consumer, work with the consumer section to develop a project that would be useful to them, something they need extra resources for. You would pitch a project to Justice Catalyst, and then the fellows who are accepted go through our Public Rights Project Fellowship program and get professional development support along with funding from Justice Catalyst. So that's a entry-level fellowship that's available for people coming straight out of law school. If you're a couple years out, the Public Rights Project has a fellowship that is typically geared for folks who are 3 to 5 years out of law school, although I will say we've had attorneys as little as 1 to 2 years out and as many as 7 to 8 years out coming through this program. It just sort of depends on their backgrounds. And that's more of a kind of entryway into a permanent job within a government office. So we have a list of host offices across the country every year who are accepted as hosts, and then we run an application process. It's basically like applying for a job within that office to work in a particular section and do affirmative litigation. So I would look at those two programs in addition to looking for honors programs in any particular agency, and then looking for whether your law school provides postgraduate public interest funding to work in an office that you choose. That's the biggest rundown I have, and I don't know if others have fellowship programs that they're aware of or funding streams that people should be thinking about.
I think it's one thing I would just point out is be flexible. In best way to put it is, there is a lot that goes on in government, and there are plenty of functions of government attorneys that you just don't know about. flexibility does not have to mean do something you hate, do something you don't believe in, do something you're not interested in. What it means is don't assume you know all of the jobs that meet your interests or satisfy your interests or match up with the kinds of skills you want to use or what you want the job to look like. There's actually probably a very good chance, it's more likely than not, that there are a number of positions or sections or practice types that you just don't know exist. And if you did, they actually could be a very good fit. The Department of Justice in California is well over 1,000 attorneys doing, I mean, I still find out about small sections or units or bureaus that I've never heard of that have been there the whole time at one of our 5 offices or spread across multiple offices. The opportunities for a variety of practices are essentially infinite within the structure. And that's actually a really good reason, I think, to contact recruiting offices or talk to public interest career advisors just to find out about stuff you don't know about. And if you go in thinking first, like, what do I like to do all day? What kinds of hours do I want to keep? What are like the broad subject areas that I'm interested in? Rather, I want to do this type of law or work at this type of section. If you just think about what do I want my day-to-day to look like, that might steer you to opportunities you didn't know about that could actually end up being a better career and end up being easier to get a job in because they're not the headline sexy issues that everyone thinks of.
Thanks, Jill and Adelina. So we've gotten a number of questions, and I think we're going to just try and get through as many of them as we can in the time that we have left. And I'll just open this up to whomever would like to answer. So the first one comes from an anonymous attendee, asks that has noticed that many of you clerked, and asks, how does the public sector view clerkships? What about using clerking to transition to the public sector after a few years of private practice?
I can say at the Federal Defender's Office and even some of my colleagues in the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office, I know that it's been pretty common for people to transition from a law firm to public sector using a clerkship. I can say that of the last 6 people that our office has hired, they've all been fresher out of law school, and I would say maybe 5 out of the 6, okay, let's say 7. They say 5 out of the 7 had clerked. So I know that it's viewed very favorably. What insights we get from that? One is just connections. So for example, if you clerked with a district judge and in our district and the federal defender or the U.S. attorney knows who the judge is, you probably have a good leg up in terms of interviewing with that particular office. And so also I feel like their office views that experience as, you've spent time working on proposed orders and preparing bench memoranda, that you're likely to be able to sort of hit the ground running in terms of writing briefs and memoranda for our office. So I think that's the insight that is sort of attributed to clerkships from our office's standpoint.
Thanks, Jerome. I want to get through a few more questions. So the next one is, I've been speaking with former colleagues who sought private firm employment in the midst of the last recession. They all felt it was harder to get interviews if they did not graduate from T14 law schools. Though this was from a big law perspective, this worry is one a lot of my classmates have who want to work in the public sector. Do you think this worry is unfounded or legitimate?
From my perspective, that hasn't been my experience at all. Particularly here in Sacramento, we have a lot of, most of the workforce is from many of the local law schools or other UC law schools that aren't necessarily in the top 14. Many of the finest attorneys we've worked with, including the newer attorneys, are from these schools. And so I both from a hiring perspective and an actual practice perspective, that hasn't been my experience.
I would say resist the urge to use a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think this may also respond to another question that I've seen in the Q&A about international attorneys applying for public sector work. The annoying answer is it depends, but what it comes down to is you may need to find another way to jump out in a stack of resumes in a way that a shiny brand name law school, is going to jump out right away. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just you may have to show a few more ways in which you are a good fit or an appealing candidate. So being a top student at a non-top tier school is definitely going to jump out. Being somebody with a really strong resume in an appropriate area, like a lot of experience in that field, is going to matter. Coming from a regional school with close regional ties to the government office you're looking for, that's going to jump out. And as an international student, if you show that you really have ties to this practice area, if you have international experience in this practice area, or if you've been apprenticing or volunteering in an American law office in this field, that can demonstrate that you've learned the relevant practice skills, that is going to be of interest. I think most employers probably care less about where you went to law school than are you, if it was out of the country, then are you experienced in the American legal idiom in the relevant practice area. So there's no one size fits all answer. You just need to sell it in a very tailored way.
Yeah, I would just say don't censor yourself. In my experience, I think the public sector is less, the whole legal profession is elitist, just, in the unfortunate reality, but I have found the public sector to be less so than other places, certainly than big law in a lot of circumstances. And so it's just about finding the right fit for you and then selling yourself for that role through your networks, through your materials, any references, etc. And so I wouldn't hold yourself back from applying to those jobs. I've similar to Gabriel, I've worked with folks from a wide variety of law schools who've been stellar and excellent colleagues and great hires.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Someone asked, does the panel have any recommendations on making impressions remotely if that's substantively different than doing so under normal circumstances?
We just hit the end of our summer internship period. And I was I'm extremely busy and scatterbrained and always running from fire drill to fire drill. So I've been terrible about affirmatively reaching out and nurturing relationships with interns. And many of them in my office this summer came to me and said, can we have an hour Zoom coffee meet just to chat and get to know each other? And those were some of the most memorable, wonderful, fun, social experiences I've had in this entire quarantine, was getting to know these absolutely wonderful law students who, took me out for virtual coffee here in my own dining room. And it was, I think, just as good, frankly, as when I've had coffee, maybe even better than with in person over the last few years. But I mean, I'm really sorry if any of them are listening right now. It was on them to come put that little extra note of effort in and to send me an email and track me down, because I have no office for them to walk by. But I don't think it was a huge lift, and it was awesome. And they got my full attention. And I think it's just adapt to the new reality, but those opportunities are still there. People are a lot easier to find, frankly, because they're at home pretty much all the time.
And looking for a break from anything that isn't just the same four walls. Anyone else have anything to add on the last point?
Yeah, just be proactive, echo everything Adelina said.
All right, well, that's an hour. Thank you all very much for sharing your thoughts and your time with us today. I think there was a question about emails and follow-ups. I think a few of us have shared our emails if people have specific questions. And a reminder for those, although if you're in law school, this is not yet a requirement, but one day it will be the bane of your existence. But for those that are looking for CLE credit, you can email lcemails@acslaw.org. We've also been recording this presentation, so it will be posted somewhere. The folks at ACS will let us know in case you'd like to come back and look or have friends who might be interested in hearing what the panelists have had to say. All right, thank you all very much. And I hope everyone continues to be as well as they can under the circumstances that we're living in. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.